I'm going to be addressing worn out shock absorbers on the 5th generation 4Runner Limited. That's going to involve an XREAS, or cross relative absorber system delete, with replacement by Bilstein 4600 shocks. Fixity fix! And here on the left front, or the driver's side, you can see evidence of a failed strut on the cross relative absorber suspension system. Evidence that the strut is leaking oil. Down here at the bottom of the strut is where the hydraulic system ties in and then runs across through pipes and valves underneath the car and connects to the opposite side, rear shock. I don't see evidence of leaks on the other shocks, but I'm going to disconnect the hydraulic system entirely at the union joints underneath the car and leave the piping that connects through the middle of the car, the front to the back, and then the front to the back on the other side, in case I want to install it again. I'll show you how to do that, or I hope my theory pans out on those unions not allowing the fluid to leak out of the system. It really doesn't matter if you're doing a hard delete and taking out all of the plumbing. If you leak fluid, then you just have to clean it up. That's your only consequence. Here I want to preserve the system in case I want to install it again at some point. I doubt I will, but we'll see. Maybe putting in the non-linked system just won't feel as good when we drive it later. Here on the front right side of the car, you've got your hydraulic line for the XREAS system right at the bottom of the strut body. Follow the hose around back, and then we're going to go down under the car, right under the wheel, right over the CV joint axle boot. You have this hydraulic union here, and you just loosen this 22 millimeter union, and you'll lose very little, if any, fluid. You can leave the system intact if you ever want to go back to your XREAS system. I'm leaving it in because I don't know. I haven't tried it without the XREAS system, and the XREAS is not working. I don't want to spend all the money, either for the parts or the labor, to put it back together when I have a lot of faith that the Bilstein shocks are going to do a good job. Here on the rear right side, we have the same hydraulic union here, also 22 millimeters where my finger is. Turns out you can slide a wrench in, 22 millimeter, right behind the sway bar end link bar, and fit it a little pressure onto the union and crack it open. And then you just have to sort of work that out with fingers or the wrench, etc. If you're unlucky and the union is tightened so that you can't get at it with your wrench around this sway bar end link, you can remove the sway bar end link and get at it a little more easily. You might also be able to loosen this bracket to get a little more wrench room. Even a millimeter at a time will get us there. I didn't do this on camera, but it's a good idea to spray these unions with brake clean just to get it super clean before you start pulling them off. Didn't use penetrating fluid on these because I didn't want to risk getting any incompatible oil into the hydraulic system in case I ever decide to put XREAS back together in this car. Like most important things in life, it just takes a lot of patience and strength. And a lot of different creative positions. Alright, those pieces are apart, and you can see there's no oil leakage from this one, leaving the system sealed with the hydraulic fluid inside the units under the car, leaving us free to remove all the hydraulics connected to the rear strut. This 12 millimeter bolt is in there, but it needs to come out. So I'm going to use a breaker bar unexpectedly. The reason you have the car up on 4 jack stands or up on a lift where all 4 shocks are fully extended is that it pulls the fluid into the shock absorber or strut, and that's why you don't get leakage here. And then this is a sealed point. I am going to go to the hardware store and get some caps to cap these up. I'll just have to match the threads. Same process here on the left rear corner of the car, but this time, lesson learned, I'm going to take off this hydraulic hose clip first, just to give me a little more room to deal with that 22mm hydraulic union in here. Using the knurling on this socket extension, use this as a tool now that I don't need the socket for this. This little connector comes out. It just gives me a little bit of wiggle room to work with here. Hopefully I won't have to remove this stabilizer bar end link to get at it. Because we're leaving the hydraulic system intact by removing only the unions, which don't allow the fluid to come out, it doesn't matter what order we remove the struts in. It would matter if you're pulling the system out completely, just because they're connected rear front. They're connected left rear to right front, right rear to left front. Look at that. Oh, tired thumbs. Well, fixie fixie's thumbs are all tired. Wow, a lot of difference in strength between the non-dominant and dominant hands. I don't know if I can wiggle that right hand in there. You might already know this, but in some situations you can flip a wrench over and it will give you a different angle to grab a nut or bolt by when you're in a tight spot like this. And flip, and grab, and flip, and grab, and just keep doing that. Might get you a millimeter at a time, but you will get there. And again, no leakage. And that shock is ready to come out the normal way. And we're just going to tighten these 12mm bolts that held the hydraulic hose bracket in for safekeeping and to keep that hole from rusting out. And we'll have it there. We won't have to go looking for it if we decide to reinstall XREAS parts. And here on the left front, or the driver's side, you can see evidence of a failed strut on the front left side or the driver's side, and it's really similar on the passenger side. Just follow this hydraulic line to this banjo fitting here. And then just above the banjo fitting is going to be the hydraulic union, and we're going to loosen and then take off the 22mm union and separate the rubber hydraulic line system, including pulling out this, I believe it's a 12mm bolt, to be able to take the whole old strut off. There's the 12mm bolt, a little hard to see. You could struggle to get little socket wrench or little wrench in near where that bolt head is, or you could just use long extensions until you're in the clear. You could go clear across the garage with an extension. It doesn't matter. A lot of times getting an extension in from far away gives you the leverage and room you need to move. Saves a lot of time in the long run. When we remove this bracket from the frame, we get access more easily to the hydraulic union that we're going to remove. This is the view from underneath the car on the driver's side. Turns out it's easier to remove this hydraulic union on the driver's side from underneath. Just in case any hydraulic fluid leaks, you're going to want to be wearing safety glasses since you're laying right underneath it. It's cramped quarters underneath here, so I only show you a limited amount. All right, so there is the piece we need to remove. Spin this 12mm bolt all the way out. And then the piece attached to the strut is ready to come out. And then here is your hydraulic line that, at least in my 4Runner, I'm going to leave in. I'll find a way to attach this to some piece and then plug it up just to make sure it doesn't get dirty here in this union. That won't let the fluid get contaminated in case I want to use it later. Next, I'm going to remove the front strut towers. There's one on the driver's side, one on the passenger side. And they're held in by 3 14mm nuts on top. This is my long 14mm wrench, which is going to help with the leverage up here. It's going to be hard to get a socket in on this back one, so I'm using the long wrench, which I highly recommend you having around for this process. So 1, 2, 3 bolts to remove. Do not, and I cannot emphasize enough, do not remove this top bolt holding the strut cartridge in, or it will release the tension on this spring, and you'll end up potentially in a world of hurt or a world of dead, or at least having all this crap jammed up in here, denting the inside of your engine compartment sheet metal, and have a bear of a time getting it out. Another consideration here, the control arm, the lower control arm here, and the upper control arm here are connected together, steering knuckle and to the strut. So I'm not sure, when we remove the strut tower from the strut retainer, this part is part of the subframe, if all of this is going to drop this wheel assembly low. If it drops too low, it's going to create too much of an opening here on your constant velocity axle joints, and the parts, the delicate parts inside these constant velocity joints, might separate. So we don't want it to drop too low. So I have a jack stand sitting here about 2 inches below the steering knuckle to keep it from dropping down too low. And that didn't keep it from dropping down and pinching my knuckles. But the bottom side of the strut tower is held in by a 19mm bolt, and here on the front side, a 19mm nut. And you want to make sure that you put this back in with the nut and bolt on the same side as you took them off. So either take a video like I'm doing, or have a picture to remind you where things go. So I'm pretty curious what's going to happen when I drop this strut out. I'm going to take the bottom 19mm nut and bolt out first. I'm using a pry bar to move the strut bottom against this bolt to work this bolt out. Won't be able to show you that on camera, but it'll just take a little bit of wiggling and working to get it out. The effective ingredient here seemed to be driving this out with a drift. There did not appear to be a clearance issue with the axles, at least here on the front right side of the car. So the jack stand is a little superfluous, but I think I'll use it on the other side just because I haven't done a driver's side yet. Don't want to mess up the axles. Up top here, to remove the 14mm nuts that are holding in the top of the strut tower, I'm removing the one in the back first, because I don't want the weight hanging on the one in the back that I have trouble getting to. I want to be able to use a tool to get the ones in the front out more easily. That's one. Two. It's going to be interesting geometrically figuring out how to get this strut tower out without having to disassemble the control arms. When we compress this strut to bring it out, some hydraulic fluid's going to escape from the strut. So for that reason, we want a drain pan underneath the hydraulic line coming from the strut. just to keep from making a giant mess. And here's where we drop the strut assembly out of the car. First, we put one strut nut just threaded on a few turns near the top to catch the assembly. We have already removed the 19mm bolt holding the bottom of the strut in to the bottom control arm. Now we're going to go under the steering knuckle. And there are two of these 19mm bolts holding in the steering knuckle. There's one on either side of the castellated nut down below. Leave the castellated nut alone, and removing those two 19mm bolts are going to allow this lower control arm to fall downward. That's why we've got a jack under it, so we can control its heavy descent, and then we'll be able to lift it back into place when it's time to put the new strut in. I am using a lift, but it's suspended on hydraulics right now, so I'm using extra jack stands under the car for this part, just in case. You can't be too careful when you're underneath a car. I'm also going to try to keep my extremities from getting underneath the car too much during this part of it. In case you didn't guess, I broke the torque on these 19mm with a breaker bar off camera. That's why they're so easy to take out right now. These two 19mm nuts came out holding a bracket that holds the lower control arm in. We remove those, and we're just going to tap on the bracket to get it to separate, we hope. We're lucky to have Sarah behind the camera here in the workshop, so we don't want to get our fingers between the control arm and the jack for this part of it. It's already touching the jack, so I'm going to lower it a little bit. And then we loosen the control arm mount bolts. There's one 22mm bolt going through this shackle here, and a matching one on the other side. We'll use a breaker bar. We're not taking these bolts all the way out. We're just loosening them so this lower control arm will be able to fall free of the rest of the suspension assemblies. We loosen this bolt. Enough for that control arm to move. You're going to need to get an alignment after this, but we have an aftermarket skid plate underneath it. If you have the stock skid plate, you might have to take the skid plate off to be able to give enough room for this control arm to move. There. We can loosen it. I'm just going slowly, having not done this before. Righty tighty, lefty loosey. There we go. Alright, so we've got plenty of movement potential in there, where the control arm's going to need to come down even farther. So, this jack out of the way. That on down. Alright, there's nothing stopping it from coming down as far as when it comes down. Let's say that's out of the way. And then, let's see if we can take this off. So I've taken off the top nut from the strut nut. Let's see if this will come out as expected. Without any of the other steering stuff off. Oh. Alright, that's the strut removed. Just to keep me from having to look things up, even in my own video as I move along, I'm going to mark which parts, which pieces were facing the front of the car for now, for reassembly later, because this is likely a several day job. So I want to remember this nut is forward, holding the bottom of the strut in on this particular side. This side of the old strut faces front, and then this is the front section of this particular strut mount. I don't want to get into a situation where I create problems for myself by not having everything line up. So we're going to mark where the orientation of the spring is so that it lands on the next strut tower. We're replacing this whole red section, and we want to make sure everything lines up correctly with the springs. It's just good practice when you have an orientation that might be ambiguous later to mark everything. In an off-camera discussion, Sarah advised that Henry Ford would say to go ahead and do both sides at once.
That's exactly what I said, yep.
So having decided on that, I'm going to go ahead and mark this one with a P for passenger, just in case there's any ambiguity as the other one comes off. I'm likely to get these things mixed up. So we'll go ahead and mark this, and we'll tackle the other side too. I think I showed you this under the car, but look at all that oil and grit and grime. This is oil that's leaked out of this bad strut. This is the whole reason the cross relative absorber system, XREAS, and this 4Runner failed in less than 60,000 miles, probably failed at 50,000 miles. That's why I'm pulling out the XREAS struts and shock absorbers and replacing them with something a little more standard, a little more reliable. I've got the old strut tower next to the new strut insert, and for the spring seat, I'm just making sure that I have a mark indicating the correct alignment of the spring end, the flat part of the spring, and the spring retainer. I want it to be pretty close on the new shock where the eyelet for the bottom of the strut lines up with where the spring end of the seat comes into play. So I have these lined up similarly, and I'm just going to do a mark on the new strut and the new spring seat so that I get that lined up. We'll set the new strut assembly aside, and we'll just clock this into position when we tighten down the new spring so that these marks line up. We need a 19mm wrench for the new bolt for the new strut, and a 17 for the old, so I'll have those here in place. I'm using Eastwood's interchangeable McPherson strut spring compressor, and it has a number of these different size spring seats to choose from that come off and on of the compressor. These are the smallest sizes in both counts, and you have to orient the shock one way or another so that you're lining up your spring seats with the springs on the strut. And that fits right in there just fine. We have a couple of Allen head bolts in here to tighten down to hold the spring seats in to make it utterly safe. Make sure you're wearing safety goggles, real safety goggles, not just glasses. I'm tightening these Allen head bolts 5mm down reasonably tight. I'm just flipping this around because I'm right-handed, and we'll tighten down the spring compressor here using this 21mm nut. Until I have it good and hand tight. And I'm going to use my socket wrench. It takes a lot of force using just one of these sticks to compress. You can can rent a cheaper and less safe version of a spring compressor at most parts stores, or even buy one for cheap, but I don't trust those things. This is much more robust. So we're just compressing this spring so that we can loosen this nut safely and pull the old strut out and put the new strut in. Alright, I can see I can wiggle this strut free of the spring. So it's getting to a point where I can probably remove it just fine. A little more for good measure. And then we pop off this 17 millimeter. We'll need to hold the stalk of the strut with this adjustable wrench. This is a lot easier of a process than it looks. A lot cheaper and I think more effective than buying pre-built quick struts. You can pick the type of strut cartridge that goes in the middle of your spring here. Make sure you're not standing in the force zone of this spring if it were to come apart. You don't want to be here or here. Make sure you're watching to make sure no tension is getting created with the spring coming loose in this area or this area. As long as that stays loose, your spring is compressed, and you're good to finish popping this nut off. Now for your top strut mount, it's just going to come off. You're going to want to pay attention to how all these pieces go together. I just keep them in order and do one side at a time, just in case you have an accident and drop things. You know the order of assembly. So all this goes together like so. And then the top comes all the way off. Keep those in the right order. And the strut pops right out. I'm going to put this back together just for safekeeping. I'm using a new strut mount. A lot of people reuse the old ones, and that's fine as long as the rubber's not damaged or perished or dry rotted. We'll replace this with new while we're in here. Just seems like it's worth the time and expense. Set that strut assembly aside. So out with the old, and then we bring in the new. Slides right in where the old one came out, and then we line up our red marks with the end of the spring here, and everything's clocked appropriately. We're going to check that several times during the process. We want to make sure that, see? Always want to pull that boot off and make sure nothing's inside there fouling how your strut's going to move up and down. All that's clean. Good thing we looked in there. Slide this back on, keeping an eye on how everything's clocked. Little retainer goes on top of the strut boot. Then we assemble these new parts to match the old. Rubber bushing is next, and then the cap with the convex side up, concave side down, and the new 19, not 17 millimeter bolt. Important note, we're only going to tighten this bolt enough to hold the strut assembly together and keep the spring tension there. When we put it, we're not going to tighten this down until we've mounted it on the car and we have the weight of the car holding it. You want to make sure you can see threads past the top of this nut though, so that it safely holds all the spring tension. That is tight enough for now. Make sure everything's clocked. And here we want to make sure that since this was facing outside, we're going to have on this top section one of these three bolts needs to line up in line with the back of your strut knuckle here at the bottom. So this back one is roughly in line here, and this spring is milled flat at the top of this rubber piece, so you can just loosen this and it'll all come out together. So all this is lined up where we want it. Back strut mount nut of the top three lined up with the back of this strut knuckle here at the bottom, and then these red lines lined up. And now we just loosen our spring compressor, keeping an eye on our alignment. All right, it's loosening. We check all the alignment one more time. Nice and loose, so the spring compressor comes out. Now we've got a new strut assembly. This is ready to go back on the car. Got our 15mm wrench at the ready, and we're removing 15mm bolts from the top of our strut tower. We're aligning using our marks on the old spring that show us which side was at the front and which side was facing out. We have the top clocked so that the innermost stud at the top is facing toward the engine compartment, and that should align with the holes. We have to go in from the bottom of the steering knuckle just the way it came out, threading it through. Had to drop the control arm a little bit lower. And then we can thread on the tower nuts, just finger tight on top of the strut tower. The one nearest the engine is hardest to get to. Finger tight on all three is fine, and it'll just hang here in place and allow you to do it one-handed. We have left the top nut slightly loose so we can align the strut with the control arm. At this point, we want to use this jack to boost the control arm into place so we can get our 19mm nuts replaced here at the bottom of the ball joint bracket that attaches to the bottom of the lower control arm, and these get torqued to 118 foot-pounds each. We use the jack to get the lower control arm into place, and then a drift carefully inserted through here, through the control arm and the new strut, to get the strut into place so I can reinsert the threaded strut retaining bolt. I'm using a little bit of grease on the smooth part of the bolt just to prevent any galling. Tapping the bolt home. Washer in place. We'll put the nut on loosely for now. We're going to want to put some Loctite on it. I have the nut marked with an F to know that the nut faces forward. This will get torqued to 70 foot-pounds once we have weight on the car. Line things up the best that we can with this jack. I have the rearmost bolt started just to hold the ball joint bracket in place against the lower control arm. And we jack this up a little bit more so we can get the threads to bite. $19mm. I'm going to add some Loctite into this void against the threads so I don't have to remove this. Same on the other side. $118 foot-pounds. Just like any multi-point suspension bolt pattern, we're going to tighten each of these two a little at a time, switching back and forth until we ultimately reach 118 foot-pounds on each 19mm bolt. $118. $118. Load the suspension using the jack till the weight of the car is supported on the springs, and we can tighten down the 19mm nut to 70 foot-pounds using Loctite on the threads at this point. £70 Now these 22mm bolt heads, one facing the front of the car and then one facing the rear of the car, get tightened back to 129 foot-pounds. The last step is to tighten all three of these 14mm nuts at the top of the strut tower to 47 foot-pounds each. And we'll sneak up on 47 foot-pounds a little bit at a time. This takes a while. These nuts are a little hard to reach, especially the inboard one. These are lock nuts, so they give a little bit more resistance than regular nuts. Get each one just touching the shoulder of the strut mount, and then torque them to 47 foot-pounds. 47 foot-pounds each. And now the 19 on top of here, we're going to do our best to approximate 18 foot-pounds. I don't have a torque wrench that'll fit there, so I'm going to do that by feel. I find the best way to get after that nut is with an elongated wrench. What I did off camera was I torqued another nut the same size to 18 foot-pounds and then checked it with this wrench so I have a sense of what it feels like. You want to go by torque, if you can, over the number of threads showing at the top, although both will get you theoretically in the ballpark. And there it is. Tightened, 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 torqued and tightened. Just checking the work here, making sure there's no binding brake or ABS lines or any other lines, making sure the strut doesn't interfere with the axle. All right, that is the new Bilstein 4600 front strut installed. It is the same drill on the other side, so I'll leave that to you. To replace the rear shock absorber unit, you'll need two 17mm wrenches or ratchets, one for the bottom bolt and then one for the top nut. Note we've already removed the hydraulic line, separating it at this hydraulic union, which has a one-way valve keeping the oil inside the system. We're going to hold on to the shock bushings, bottom and top, and we'll do a little machining on one of the metal flanges using a die grinder to make it fit the new shock, which has a bit of a wider stanchion. I'm going to use a long wrench to loosen this nut. Can't quite fit the ratcheting wrench on here, so we're just going to do it the old-fashioned way. keep up with these bushings. $17mm bolt at the bottom got blasted out with the impact wrench. And we're gonna just work the end of the shock off of here. If you didn't want to wrestle with it that much, this 12mm banjo nut will come out, and that will release the fluid in the shock, so the shock will come down very easily. I just didn't want to deal with the mess, so I wrestled with it. Next, we need to work the bushings and metal flanges off of the old shock to put them on the new shock. Penetrating oil is your friend here. Hammer and drift are going to help get this flange off of the old shock. The issue with this old metal flange on this rubber bushing, the new shock has got a thicker stanchion, and it's also circular, so I'm going to use a die grinder with just a standard rounded conical bit to round off these flat edges, so this will fit over the new shock. The rubber on here will accommodate the girth of the new shock stanchion. Cleaning up the shock mounting pawl here, adding some clean synthetic grease to it, not very much. Routing the shock inside of the emergency brake cable. Blue Loctite on our threads. Get these started so the shock doesn't fall off and smush your toes while you're working on this next part. Because this is a pivot point, you can go ahead and tighten it to 70 foot-pounds. That seals the deal with the Loctite. I've sprayed anything that had any rust starting, cleaned and sprayed anything that had any rust starting with Rust Reform primer, including the shock mount piece on the frame. Now it's time to hold this in position. There's a little clocking piece here that goes into the frame, holds this in place. We're going to cut our shock band here and let the shock rise to the occasion and try to guide it home. See if we can do all this quickly enough. Apply Loctite to the top of the shock threads. Then we have a 19mm nut from Bilstein here. I just used the lift to lower the car a bit so that it's supported on this axle on this jack stand. It's always best to do your final torquing of suspension components when the suspension is supporting the weight of the vehicle. 47 foot-pounds is what we're aiming for. Since I can't get a torque wrench in there, tightened a similar nut that I can get at to 47 foot-pounds. Gotten a feel for it with my long wrench. We're gonna do our best approximation. A reasonable approximation's just fine here. Go ahead and let me have it in the comments. Grab myself a 22mm wrench to hold the top of the stanchion as it starts to turn along with the nut. All right, that feels like 47 foot-pounds. Checking our work. Nothing is binding. And let's get this. There we go. The boot is super important. It protects the vulnerable piece of the shock stanchion from getting ground up by sand and dirt. So making sure this is in good order will keep things going for a long time. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, please give it a like, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel. And if you hit the bell button when you subscribe, you'll get notified when a new Fixity Fix video drops.